Okay, hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. This is CounterYolo bringing you another Star Trek Online video. And in today's video, I'm going to talk about our new 32nd century starship, the Courage Science Destroyer. And we will be going into it. The overview section for this video is going to be a little bit longer than normal. There's a lot to talk about with this particular starship. There'll actually be two separate sections for Starship Comparisons, the science mode and the tactical mode of this particular starship. And then we'll briefly go over the trade in console and experimental weapon at the end of the video, and with a 30-second TLDR because it's very, very quick for the end. Feel free to see the time links in the description or at the time bar at the bottom of the screen. And with that, we'll get started with the overview. Now, when I initially saw this ship, and this is a Pro Pack starship, by the way, so it's a single character starship. When I initially saw this starship, my initial thought was, oh, this is just the Orville, but it's got this extra tower thingy at the back. And then I realized, oh wait, this is actually supposed to be a starship from Star Trek Discovery. So apparently this is a starship in that show. I don't recall seeing that ship, but then again, I only saw season 3 like once. So I can't recall it, but when I initially saw this ship, I thought of the Orville. But when it comes to this new ship, it is a science destroyer. So what that means is that it's got a base of 7 weapons. And then whenever you go into tactical mode, you get an experimental weapon slot added to the rear for the cost that while you are in tactical mode, you do lose access to the secondary deflector. Keep in mind, most exotic-based starships, most of their damage is coming from that secondary deflector. So it is a pretty heavy cost to go into tactical mode. Now granted, your Lieutenant Commander Tactical seat becomes Commander Tactical, and your Commander Science becomes Lieutenant Commander Science. So there is definitely some things with the subclass that can have issues. Normally with Science Destroyers, the tactical mode is pretty much a hindrance for newer players. This new Science Destroyer is actually different, and it's because both the Commander and the Lieutenant Commander seat have a specialization in them, and it's actually a worthwhile specialization. In the past, we have had the Section 31 Intel Science Destroyer that was Commander Science Intel and Lieutenant Commander Science Intel, but because Intel is generally speaking the weakest specialization both from the different specialization abilities as well as the commander mechanic of them, it wasn't really a super worthwhile one. However, the command specialization is really strong. So it is really nice that we're seeing that on in those seats for this. Overall, we're talking about the raw stats themselves. The two people on the stream did mention that the theme for the 32nd century starships in general is that they have really high hull and really low shields, leaning in on the theme of programmable matter. I guess that's the way that they're going to be interpreting that going forward. The interesting thing about this ship, honestly, is that it's got the durability of a cruiser from its hull and shield ratio, but it still has the maneuverability of your destroyers and warships, essentially, with its turn, impulse, and inertia, which from those base stats alone probably leans more towards the promo pack types of starships for its base stats. If we had a lower turn, impulse, and inertia, or a little bit lower hull ratio, then we can more lean towards something like a lockbox starship. So I do understand where they're coming from as to why they can put this in promo packs. The design itself probably isn't going to be the most enticing for players. Nonetheless, it still has lots of great stuff for it. It's got tactical mode for this. You can alternate between 2 different modes for this ship, and again, because both tactical mode and science mode both have really strong merits. And to make that easier, I've shown what science mode and tactical mode both look like, as slight differences between them. Both these bridge off your seatings are actually nice. Now, yes, for a pure DPS captain, I don't really think either one of these seating is going to be extremely enticing. Especially for science mode, you probably would rather have an ensign engineering just for emergency power to auxiliary and full science and tactical abilities from there. Tactical mode, a little bit more legitimate, especially if you're wanting to do like an Ox to Bat build. Having something like that can be useful. However, in order to get full Ox to Bat, you'd have to make this with Samurai Penalty Reversal and Nether Engineering. So for DPS captains, this might not be the best starship either. That being said, having command seating means this is still going to be a solid torque boat either way. For me, though, looking between these two modes, both of them are going to work pretty well for tanking. Which means overall, the way that my first impressions, just looking at the bridge offer seating and its base stats, this is probably going to be our best jack of all trades tanking platform inside the game. Which is something that's difficult for me to say. In the past, I said that the promo pack to list Temporal Warbird was basically the jack of all trades starship in the game. Now we finally have a competitor versus that ship. It's not as fast maneuverable as that ship for the ship, but for basically anything else besides PvP, I think this is finally a ship that has finally overtaken that ship. Thanks to its Science Destroyer mechanics stuff in what the ship can actually do. So for easiness, what I've done here, and this will be in the PDF in the description because I'm not going to go into these builds themselves. I've put a couple of example stuff for bridge officer suggestions for these, as well as some starship traits that will help out with those bridge officer suggestions. Most of these starship traits are for ones that are through the C store in some way or another, or traits that are earnable inside the game. Again, you can go ahead and see the PDF for these various builds in both science mode and a tactical mode for the various types of tanking stuff in the game. In the next week or two, I will be doing a video for cookie cutter tanking builds that will go more in depth into how I decide on bridge officer abilities and my personal tanking stuff. For those of you that want to basically start making that on your own. But that's just it for me. TLDR for this overview. The aesthetics is going to be weird, and the trade and console that I'll cover later and the experimental weapon probably aren't going to be top tier. Okay, maybe the experimental weapon might be, but the other ones probably won't. And the aesthetics are weird again, but it's bridge offer seating, and the fact that it's a Science Destroyer does give extreme flexibility for a tanking aspect, which actually does make this enticing for me to potentially want to go and get. If it wasn't a promo pack starship, it would be a whole lot easier. But with that said, I'll go into two Starship Comparisons now. As noted, because this is a Science Destroyer and because both modes are actually really good for tanking, I'm going to have two different sessions for this. One for Science mode, or exotic based, and one for Tactical mode, or pure weapons based, like Firewall or Scatter Volley. So in this first section, I'm going to be talking about science ships or starships that have a secondary deflector slot. We'll start off with some fleet starships. Recently, last fall, winterish, we got the Fleet Titan, which is a really great ship. It doesn't have flexible bridge offer seating, but for its raw durability, it is still a fantastic starship. And you still get Lieutenant Commander command, so you can do torpedo stuff on this ship if you so choose. The Fleet Trainer Scout ship, as noted in other videos, it is one of the most maneuverable science vessels in the game. And as a note here, it's got a 0.2 impulse. And the Courage also has a 0.2 impulse. And that's why I was also kind of surprised about how this ship was allowed to be so fast considering everything else. Traditionally, for most science vessels in the game, if it's going to have high maneuverability and high impulse, it's going to have lower base stats. And this ship does not follow that convention. Again, more leaning towards that's probably a promo pack starship, because promo pack ships are allowed to more break the rules of the subclasses. For some more fleet ships, we have the Fleet Nautilus, which is our more offensive based fleet starship. For pure science vessels, and the Oberth is a little bit more defensive oriented. Both fine in their own ways. Just honestly, most people choose between the two is more down to the aesthetics than anything else. They're both Commander Temporal, so they're both going to be great. Of course, we have the Vern, which is the staple for most of the DPS community for science vessels, and it's why most of that community pretty much ignores most science vessels that come out nowadays. which is why for a while now I've been advocating for Cryptic to say, hey, you probably should just be releasing science destroyers. So you're still giving science vessels for the science community, but at the same time, letting tactical mode be available and be good so that your other portion of the player base will still buy the ship. A few months ago, we got the promo Janeway class, which has a bit more maneuverability. Again, it's another promo ship, but it's got lower durability to make up for that higher maneuverability over the Courage. And there's no tactical mode for this ship, so that is a bit of a downside for the ship overall. Granted, it does have engineering, so it's going to be a bit more ideal for the DPS community. Up to you as to whether this ship or the Courage is a better option for you. My personal favorites for a long time for tanking is the Legendary Intrepid with Commander Miracle Worker and a Hangar Bay, and it being an account to unlock through the 10th anniversary Legendary bundle that had 10 starships in it. And of course, a Sea Store Eternal, which is our tried and true staple for not only the tanking community, but also just for the DPS community in general, because it's an account to unlock temporal starship. That's a very, very just all-around solid ship. Not a big standout versus some of the bigger contenders nowadays for the DPS community, but it's still a fantastic tanking starship. When it comes to crossfields, of course, we have the Legendary Glenn with Commander Temporal and Tank Commander Command. If you're going for a side torp build, it is going to be hard to contend against this ship because of how strong this is. But if you're going for a pure torp or light torpedo with science stuff on it, the Courage is not going to be terrible. Of course, we have the classic crossfield, which I still love because it's got reasonable durability alongside reasonable hull and reasonable shields. Which again, most others of the variants for the crossfield nowadays pretty much are heavily into the shields or heavily into the hull. Now, if you notice here, we have two other science destroyers that are also promo pack starships. Especially early on when Crypto was making more tier 6 science destroyers, initially they had more animations behind them. This new science destroyer, the ship just turns on a 180 and you fly in the other direction. So the animation itself is not that complicated. Some stuff under the hood with moving like weapon points and such, and engine and deflector trails and things is probably a little bit more complicated. At least that's things you can kind of like hide behind the curtain. Animations of whether the cells go up or down, when that breaks, it's hard to kind of hide that. So I definitely get that, especially with some of the newer science destroyers. It is a fun mechanic in the game, but it's also one that's expensive if done poorly, especially for upkeeping. So I definitely understand why Cryptic has switched to this type of style. Like they started that with the Fleet Titan, that it was just a color difference on the top. Now for weapons-based stuff, we'll go into that now. For this, I have decided to switch the actual look of the bridge. I've seen it a little bit around for the ship. I've changed the parentheses out of this instead of it being a parentheses. Basically, you have the option to make it experimental. When you're in tactical mode, it isn't just a you pseudo have it, you actually do have the experimental weapon. I could have technically marked out the secondary deflector, but I just decided not to. I've also decided to include the Crossfield Science Spirit refit here, just because this build, or at least this starship, for me at least, leans more towards a psi energy kind of like combination build instead of pure science. Because Miracle Worker is really nice to be able to do that pretty easily. And if you look at the raw stats here, the Crossfield refit is a 31st century starship that, if you look at the base stats here, it's just a smidget lower for the most part besides its turning. And so is Battle Cloak and such. So I do understand from a sort of standpoint where they're getting and buffing the Courage to make it so that it's just a little bit more to justify the promo. But the Crossfield is very, very, very close. The Crossfield refit, pretty close. In terms of fleet stuff, the Suban Silicate, it's really hard to beat that ship, at least from a tanky perspective for weapons. In the Fleet Coj, it's a solid, much earlier to acquire ship as well, because that's a tier 1 fleet military versus a tier 4 fleet military. So there's differences there. Probably the closest versus the courage and tactical mode is probably strike wing escorts, especially the fleet angle is very, very similar. Although its ratios are not as high, it's got similar maneuverability besides a higher turn versus the courage. For that exchange, you know that it is way lower on its hull. But you still have a lieutenant commander commands. You can still do that stuff, and you have a hangar bay instead of tactical mode. And of course, we have the Strike Wing Warbird from the Picard TV show, which is also a very, very solid option too. When it comes to classic tanks, basically these are the tanks that I recommend if you don't have the DPRM console available to you. Legendary Odyssey is a fantastic broadsiding tank, and then any of the scimitars are fantastic. Technically, I probably should have shown the science scimitar, because that one has the one that has the Lieutenant Commander Science and Lieutenant Engineering. Basically, it was a Starship where this Lieutenant Engineering C and this Lieutenant Science are basically flipped, and otherwise it looks the exact same. Oh, and you have one less tactical console on that ship. Otherwise, it looks basically the same overall for everything else on the Science variant. When it comes to destroyers, we have the Veteran Fleet Gemini Vanguard Heavy Destroyer, which has Lieutenant Commander Engineering. And it's got a lower hull, but it does have good maneuverability. And the Fleet Gemini Vanguard Temporal Warship has Commander Tactical and Lieutenant Commander Science as well, and Lieutenant Engineering. Downsides is that it's got a Force Lieutenant Tactical and Lieutenant Universal versus this ship which has Lieutenant Commander Universal and Ensign Universal. So a slight bit of an upgrade there, but you're down one console here versus over on the Temporal Warships. And then lastly, for Juggernauts, last but not least, obviously these are the ships that have really, really high durability in the hull and shields for the cost that you are super, super slow and super, super just not maneuverable. Now, the Borg ship does actually have good inertia. That's something really nice about it. Even though it has a low turn, low impulse, it's at least going to turn on a dime. It's just that it's not going to, well, it's going to take the long time to turn, but it's not going to slide. Sorry, that's the right terminology for it. Borg Juggernaut is just going to slide and turns poorly, but it's got very good offensive potential. That's what it comes down to. Okay, with that said, let's go into the extras for this ship. I pasted from the 10-4 weekly the trait, the console, and the experimental weapon from all that. The console is called Force Translator. It passively gives you extra energy damage that scales with auxiliary power, as well as maximum hull capacity increase. Its active is a PB AoE kinetic damage that's based upon both your maximum HP as well as the speed before you activate the ability. I think it's going to be more of a situational one when it comes to click keys. Hopefully, with this repel thing going on and then the click key, it might be a decent threat generator when it comes down to it. Hopefully, there's something really good there. The Starship Ray is called Directional Bias. What this does, whenever you're damaged in the front of your ship, you get an additional 5% bonus exotic damage. Bridge abilities per stack. I think they mentioned that it was the stacks each second. If it's not each second, then this trait's gonna suck. And then you lose all the stacks when you use an exotic power, and then the opposite part, whenever you damage in the rear, you get additional regeneration and healing every second, max 10 stacks, and that stacks are removed whenever you use a healing power. This, especially because this is supposed to be, you know, a forward-facing starship, the exotic damage is probably where the value of this trait is going to be. That being said, we have a trait, an older trait called Improved Atomic Officer, which is from the Tholian Iktomi, which is a low-by-store starship, so meaningfully cheaper, like on a magnitude of like a tenth of the other price of these ships typically, if not much cheaper even than that. And this is a trait that's basically up the whole time, as long as you have the Improved Atomic Officer ability, which you will if you're using an exotic-based starship. And this one automatically gives you 25% bonuses to hull and shield healing, and a 25% to bonus exotic damage. So for the way that I see this directional bias trait, this is, in my opinion, intended to be an extra source of bonus exotic damage for tanking captains that don't have a ton of anomalies. Like basically, if you're doing an exotic tank, this will be an okay trait for you. I'm not going to be sure if it's that it'll replace any of the ones that I would use, but it should be a decent trait. The bonus healing and stuff whenever you're hitting the rear is not going to matter. It's going to be the front stacks of getting you extra bonus exotic damage. And again, that's only going to be valuable if you're someone who's not blasting anomalies every couple of seconds, because otherwise there are other traits that are just going to go much further for you. Just my personal opinion. I'm sure SG Reddit can figure out ways to break this trait for sure. And so I guess we'll wait for their work to see what happens with that. The new experimental weapon with the ship, because the ship does get an experimental weapon slot, it's called Inherent Integrity Projector. This is an experimental weapon that scales with your maximum HP. By the way, maximum HP is not including temporary HP. So just as an FYI, there were some people on Reddit that were mistakenly confusing the two. That is not the case. Temporary HP is different than maximum HP. Unless something specifically is increasing your maximum HP by doing something, it is not going to be helping this experimental weapon. They did mention on stream that it's only to a cap of 250,000 maximum HP. I have gotten meaningfully higher than that, and I even mentioned so on Reddit a month and a half ago, because that's when BoardKids was asking about it. As you can see, they planned different traits well in advance of us ever knowing about it. Overall, I think the console trade and experimental weapon are fine. I don't think any of them are going to be overpowered unless the Force Translator clicky is just super overpowered for tanking. But we will see. So for TLDR, we are getting a new 32nd Century Science Destroyer. It is in promo packs, so that is a really big downside. The biggest reason, in my opinion, to get this ship is, first off, it is a very solid torpedo platform, but more importantly, it's basically the jack of all trades tanking platform. It's not meant to be a master of any of the playstyles for tanking, but it can pretty much perform any of them. And I think that is pretty amazing. Beyond that, obviously, you know, if you don't care about that and don't care about having a super solid torpedo platform and want something else, keep in mind there are cheaper torpedo options for starships that are better performing than this ship. There also are specific taking options for different places like Scatter Volley, Fire Will, those things like that other starships are just better than it because they're specialized for those types of things. Also, keep in mind, this 32nd century aesthetic isn't really for everyone. And that is okay. I'm not an employee of Cryptic. I won't get in trouble for saying that. Yeah, some ships like this one are really awkward, and it's just what it comes down to. But yeah, this is basically the end of the video. Thanks for watching. Thanks for also being patient with me when I made that Salasa video earlier this week. It was a video that I wanted to make. I knew it would do terrible on the channel, but it was something that I wanted to make anyways. There is a lot of things I am working on right now for Star Trek Online content, so I will hopefully for the next little while be getting out weekly videos, at least for the next month or two, because there's a lot that is in the works right now. So please subscribe if you want to get notified when those things show up, and also feel free to like the video if you like the video and like what I do. If you want to comment, that helps the algorithm too, but you know, it definitely is what it is. The world is getting weird, and YouTube could definitely change along with it over the next few months. Thank you all for watching, and enjoy the rest of your day.